It is a peculiarity of my long association with Hercule Poirot that I have learned to recognize the scent of impending drama as surely as a hound recognizes the fox. On the evening of October 15th, 1934, as I stood in the elegant drawing room of Lady Pemberton's Belgravia mansion, that familiar prickling sensation crept along my spine, the unmistakable atmosphere that precedes revelation, scandal, and quite possibly murder. Poirot himself was, regrettably, absent from what promised to be a most intriguing gathering. The little grey cells, mon ami, he had explained earlier that afternoon while adjusting his perfectly symmetrical mustache. They require precision in all things. Tonight I have an appointment with Monsieur Dubois, the tailor, a matter of 3 millimeters in the sleeve length. It is a crime against order that cannot be permitted to continue. Thus it was that I found myself alone among Lady Pemberton's carefully selected guests, each of whom seemed to vibrate with barely contained tension. The occasion was ostensibly a private viewing of her latest acquisition, a portrait that had, according to whispered rumors throughout London's art circles, cost her deceased husband's estate a sum that would have purchased a modest country house. Lady Vivian Pemberton herself was a woman of perhaps 55 years, possessed of that particular brand of English beauty that improves with age like fine wine. Her silver hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, and her black evening dress, worn, she had mentioned, out of respect for her husband's recent passing, only served to emphasize the striking intelligence in her gray eyes. Yet tonight, beneath her composed exterior, I detected something else, a determination that bordered on the reckless. "Captain Hastings," she said, approaching me with a crystal glass of champagne, "how good of you to come, even without your famous Belgian friend. I confess I had hoped Monsieur Poirot might be here tonight. I have a feeling his particular talents may soon be required." Before I could inquire as to her meaning, she guided me toward the magnificent fireplace that dominated the room's far wall. Above the marble mantelpiece hung the object of the evening's attention, a portrait of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. The subject was a woman of perhaps 30 years, painted in the style of the late 17th century. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate curls, her pale hands folded gracefully in her lap, and her eyes, those remarkable eyes, seemed to follow one's movement with an almost unsettling intensity. "May I present," Lady Pemberton announced to the assembled company, "the portrait of Countess Isabella de Montclair, painted by the master Giovanni Toretti in 1687. She was, by all accounts, a woman of extraordinary beauty and equally extraordinary determination." The other guests had gathered around us, each studying the painting with varying degrees of interest and expertise. Mr. Reginald Ashworth, Lady Pemberton's nephew and heir, was a man of 40 with the soft features and calculating eyes of one who has never worked for his living. Beside him stood Miss Catherine Fairfax, Lady Pemberton's companion, a woman of perhaps 35, quietly elegant, with the observant manner of one accustomed to seeing much and saying little. Dr. Edmund Thornley, the family physician, examined the portrait with the clinical interest he might have shown a particularly fascinating medical specimen. His gray beard was meticulously trimmed, and his dark eyes held the sharp intelligence of a man accustomed to diagnosing ailments both physical and moral. Mr. Silas Blackwood, the art dealer who had facilitated the portrait's acquisition, hovered nearby with the nervous energy of a man whose professional reputation hung in the balance. His thin frame was impeccably dressed, but his fingers betrayed his anxiety by their constant fidgeting with his watch chain. Finally, there was Miss Evelyn Hartwell, a young woman of perhaps 28, whose presence seemed somewhat incongruous among the older, more established guests. She had been introduced as a researcher specializing in Renaissance art, though her intense interest in the portrait suggested a more personal connection to the piece. "The provenance," Mr. Blackwood was explaining in his cultured voice, "is absolutely impeccable. The portrait remained in the Montclair family until 1789, when it disappeared during the Revolution. It surfaced briefly in Vienna in 1823, then vanished again until I located it in a private collection in Florence last year. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Thornley. And the subject, this Countess Isabella, what became of her? Miss Hartwell stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with scholarly enthusiasm. According to the historical records, she died under rather mysterious circumstances in 1691. The official cause was given as a fever, but contemporary accounts suggest... She paused, glancing uncertainly at Lady Pemberton. "Please, my dear," Lady Pemberton encouraged. "We are all friends here." "Well," Miss Hartwell continued, lowering her voice slightly, "there were rumors of poison. It seems the Countess had made several powerful enemies through her political activities. She was known to be a woman who refused to be silenced or controlled." Lady Pemberton's eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. "Indeed, a woman after my own heart, one might say." She moved closer to the fireplace, her gaze fixed on the portrait. "Which brings me to the reason I asked you all here tonight." The room fell silent, save for the gentle crackling of the fire in the grate. Even I, accustomed as I was to dramatic revelations, felt my pulse quicken. 3 days ago," Lady Pemberton continued, "I received some rather disturbing information regarding this portrait. Information that suggests its authenticity may be questionable." Mr. Blackwood's face went ashen. "Lady Pemberton, I can assure you that every aspect of the provenance has been thoroughly verified. The authentication process was exhaustive." She held up a hand to silence him. "I'm sure it was, Mr. Blackwood. However, I've decided that there is only one way to settle the matter definitively." She turned to face us all, her expression resolute. "I intend to subject the portrait to what I call the ultimate test of authenticity." "And what might that be?" asked Mr. Ashworth, his voice tight with what I suspected was financial concern. Lady Pemberton smiled, a smile that sent an inexplicable chill through me. "I'm going to burn it." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Dr. Thornley's medical bag slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a dull thud. Miss Fairfax gasped audibly. Mr. Blackwood appeared on the verge of apoplexy. "Aunt Vivian," Mr. Ashworth stammered, "surely you cannot be serious. The insurance alone—" "I am perfectly serious, Reginald," she replied calmly. "You see, I have it on excellent authority that a genuine Toretti, painted with the materials and techniques of the 17th century, will burn in a very specific manner. The oils, the canvas preparation, the varnishes, all will react to flame in ways that can be precisely predicted. A modern forgery, however skillfully executed, will betray itself in the fire." Miss Hartwell stepped forward, her face pale. "Lady Pemberton, even if you suspect the painting is not authentic, surely there are less destructive methods of verification?" "Perhaps," Lady Pemberton acknowledged. "But I find that fire has a way of revealing truth that no amount of scholarly analysis can match. Besides," she added with that unsettling smile, "if it is genuine, it will survive. If it is not—" She shrugged elegantly. Before anyone could protest further, she reached up and lifted the portrait from its hooks. The frame was heavier than it appeared, and for a moment I thought she might drop it, but she managed to lower it carefully to the hearth rug, positioning it so that the bottom edge of the canvas was mere inches from the dancing flames. "Lady Pemberton," I found myself saying, "perhaps we should wait for Poirot. He has considerable experience with questions of authenticity and—" "No, Captain Hastings," she said firmly. "This is something I must do myself. Now. Tonight." With a swift, decisive movement, she tilted the portrait forward, pressing the lower edge of the canvas against the burning logs. What happened next defied all rational explanation. The flames, which had been leaping cheerfully in the grate, suddenly died back as if recoiling from the canvas. A strange, acrid smell filled the air, not the expected scent of burning paint and varnish, but something metallic and cold. The portrait itself seemed to shimmer, as if the painted surface were made of water rather than oils. For perhaps 30 seconds, we all stood transfixed, watching as the fire appeared to struggle against the canvas, licking at its edges but failing to catch hold. Then, with a sound like a sharp intake of breath, the flames suddenly roared back to life, higher and more intense than before. But the portrait remained untouched. Lady Pemberton withdrew it from the fire, her hands trembling slightly. The canvas showed no sign of damage, not so much as a scorch mark or a curl of smoke-blackened paint. The Countess Isabella gazed out at us with the same enigmatic expression, as if amused by our astonishment. "Mon Dieu," whispered Mr. Blackwood. "It is impossible." "Impossible," agreed Dr. Thornley, his scientific mind clearly struggling with what he had witnessed. "The laws of physics simply do not permit—" His words were cut short by a sound that made us all freeze, the sharp, unmistakable report of a pistol shot coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Lady Pemberton's eyes widened in alarm. "That came from the library," she said, setting the portrait carefully aside. "Quickly!" We rushed from the drawing room, through the marble-floored hallway and into the library, a magnificent room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. There, sprawled beside an overturned chair, lay the still form of Mr. Blackwood's assistant, a young man named Timothy Marsh, whom I had barely noticed among the evening's guests. Dr. Thornley immediately knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life, while the rest of us stood in shocked silence. After a moment, he looked up and shook his head gravely. "He's dead," he announced, "shot through the heart at close range." As if this revelation had broken some spell, voices began to rise in confusion and alarm. But through it all, one image remained burned in my memory: the portrait of Countess Isabella, sitting innocently beside the fireplace, completely unmarked by flames that should have consumed it in seconds. I found myself thinking of Poirot's frequent observation that in every mystery, the most impossible element often proves to be the key to the entire puzzle. As I looked around at the faces of our fellow guests, each now a potential suspect in what was clearly murder, I could not shake the feeling that the portrait's strange behavior was intimately connected to the tragedy that had just unfolded. The evening that had begun with questions of artistic authenticity had transformed into something far more sinister. And somewhere in Belgravia, Hercule Poirot was undoubtedly still discussing sleeve measurements with his tailor, blissfully unaware that his expertise in matters far more serious than sartorial precision would soon be desperately needed. The library had transformed from a sanctuary of learning into a scene of stark tragedy. Dr. Thornley knelt beside Timothy Marsh's still form, his medical examination swift and definitive. "Shot through the heart at close range," he announced, his professional composure intact despite the circumstances. Death would have been instantaneous. Lady Pemberton moved with remarkable composure, immediately taking charge of the situation. "Morrison," she instructed her butler, who had appeared at the first sound of commotion, "telephone the police at once and ensure that no one leaves the premises. We are all, I'm afraid, now suspects in a murder investigation." The weight of her words settled over us like a funeral shroud. Mr. Reginald Ashworth, his soft features drawn with anxiety, moved nervously toward the French windows that stood open to the night air. "Surely, Aunt Vivian, you cannot seriously suggest that one of us—" "I suggest nothing, Reginald," she replied coolly. "I merely state facts. A man has been murdered in my house while we were all present. Until the authorities determine otherwise, we must all be considered potential culprits." Miss Catherine Fairfax had positioned herself near the doorway, her trained eye cataloguing every detail with the sharp attention of one accustomed to observing human nature. Mr. Blackwood paced frantically, his thin frame practically vibrating with nervous energy. "This is catastrophic," he muttered. "Poor Timothy, and the reputation of my gallery." Miss Evelyn Hartwell clutched her leather portfolio to her chest, her earlier scholarly enthusiasm replaced by pale, stricken silence. The irony was not lost on any of us. She had spoken of Countess Isabella's mysterious death mere minutes before witnessing a murder in the same house. I found myself studying each face, wondering which among them concealed the heart of a killer. The telephone rang sharply, and I seized the opportunity to contact Poirot. "Hello? Poirot speaking." Poirot, the sharp crack of the pistol shot, had shattered more than the evening's tranquility. It had transformed Lady Pemberton's elegant gathering into a collection of potential murderers, each now viewing the others with the wary suspicion that sudden death inevitably breeds. Dr. Thornley rose from beside Timothy Marsh's still form, his medical assessment complete. "Shot through the heart at close range," he announced grimly. "Death would have been instantaneous. I estimate the time at approximately 8:45. Lady Pemberton, despite the shock, was the first to recover her composure. "Hargreaves," she called to her butler, who had appeared in the doorway with the pale countenance of one who has witnessed too much drama for a single evening. "Telephone the police immediately and ensure that no one leaves the premises." Within 20 minutes, the measured tread of official boots echoed through the marble hallway. Inspector Bradshaw of Scotland Yard entered with the methodical efficiency that such grim circumstances demanded. A competent man whose weathered features spoke of long experience with humanity's darker impulses. "Lady Pemberton," he began, his voice carrying the weight of professional authority, "a most regrettable business. I'll need to examine the scene immediately, and no one is to leave until we've conducted proper interviews." The library was swiftly cordoned off, the body photographed, and preliminary examinations completed. When Bradshaw emerged, he carried with him a leather portfolio that had been clutched in the victim's hand. "Found this with young Marsh," he announced, opening the portfolio to reveal several documents. "Correspondence in Italian, and some rather detailed photographs of that portrait of yours, Lady Pemberton. Seems our victim was researching more than just authentication records." Miss Hartwell stepped forward, her scholarly enthusiasm momentarily overcoming her shock. "I have some facility with Italian, Inspector. These letters appear to be from a private collector in Florence, discussing what he calls the Montclair deception. He mentions something about the original truth being far more valuable than the beautiful lie." The implications sent a visible tremor through Mr. Blackwood, whose face had gone ashen. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "The authentication was absolutely thorough. I stake my reputation on it." "Your reputation," observed Dr. Thornley with clinical detachment, "may be the least of your concerns at present, Blackwood." Mr. Ashworth had been pacing restlessly, his agitation barely concealed beneath his well-tailored exterior. "Inspector, surely this is simply a case of burglary gone wrong. Young Marsh surprised an intruder and—" "Unlikely, sir," Bradshaw interrupted. "No signs of forced entry, windows secured from inside. This has all the hallmarks of someone who was expected, someone who belonged here tonight." The weight of this observation settled over our assembled group like a shroud. Each person present was now, by grim necessity, a suspect in Timothy Marsh's murder. Miss Fairfax, who had maintained her customary quiet efficiency throughout the crisis, cleared her throat delicately. "Inspector, I should mention that I observed Mr. Marsh in the library approximately 10 minutes before we heard the shot. He appeared to be examining something at Lady Pemberton's desk with great intensity. When he noticed me, he seemed startled, almost guilty, if I may say so." "Guilty of what, exactly?" Dr. Thornley inquired. "That, I'm afraid, I cannot determine," Miss Fairfax replied. "But his manner suggested he had discovered something he found deeply troubling." Inspector Bradshaw made careful notes, his experienced eye cataloguing not just the facts, but the subtle interplay of tensions among the suspects. The evening that had begun with questions of artistic authenticity had transformed into something far more sinister. As we were directed back to the drawing room under police supervision, my eyes were drawn once again to the portrait of Countess Isabella. The painting sat exactly where Lady Pemberton had left it after her extraordinary experiment with fire, seemingly innocent in its beauty. Yet now, in light of recent events, those painted eyes seemed to hold secrets far more dangerous than mere questions of provenance. The atmosphere in the drawing room grew heavy with unspoken accusations and barely contained fear. Each individual seemed to shrink inward, their earlier camaraderie dissolving under the cold scrutiny of official suspicion. It was precisely at this moment of maximum tension that the familiar sound of measured footsteps echoed through the entrance hall, followed by the butler's apologetic voice explaining the circumstances to a new arrival. Hercule Poirot had finally arrived, and with him the promise that order might yet be restored from chaos. Chapter 3. Poirot arrives. The little grey cells are summoned. Hercule Poirot entered Lady Pemberton's drawing room with the unhurried precision of a master craftsman approaching his workbench. Despite the late hour and the dramatic circumstances that had summoned him, his appearance remained immaculate, every detail of his dress perfect, his mustache waxed to geometrical perfection, his patent leather shoes gleaming even in the subdued lamplight. "Mes amis," he announced, surveying the assembled company with those penetrating green eyes. "I regret that my appointment with Monsieur Dubois has been interrupted by matters of considerably greater import." His gaze found mine across the room. "Hastings, mon vieux, your telephone message was most intriguing, though perhaps lacking in certain essential details." Inspector Bradshaw rose with evident relief. "Monsieur Poirot, thank goodness you're here. We have a most perplexing situation, a murder that appears to have been committed by someone within this very room." "Précisément what I would expect," Poirot replied, removing his gloves with characteristic deliberation. The locked room, the closed circle of suspects, the mysterious circumstances, all the elements of a puzzle worthy of attention. He moved immediately to the fireplace where the portrait still rested, studying it with the intense concentration he typically reserved for the most significant clues. For several minutes he examined the painting from various angles, occasionally making small sounds of interest that conveyed nothing to the casual observer but spoke volumes to those familiar with his methods. "Lady Pemberton," he said finally, turning to face our hostess with courteous attention, "you will permit me to express my condolences on this tragic disruption of your evening. But perhaps you will also explain what inspired you to subject this beautiful work to the rather dramatic test of fire." Lady Pemberton's composure, which had remained admirably intact throughout the evening's traumatic events, seemed to waver slightly under Poirot's direct scrutiny. "I received information suggesting the portrait might not be authentic," she replied carefully. "I believed fire would provide a definitive answer to questions of provenance." "Ah, but fire, madame, 'tis a most destructive method of authentication, n'est-ce pas? Surely there were other, less irreversible approaches available to a woman of your evident sophistication." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but I am not a patient woman, Monsieur Poirot. When I suspect deception, I prefer to confront it directly rather than endure prolonged uncertainty." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his sharp eyes noting not just her words, but the subtle tensions in her posture, the careful control of her voice. "And this information you received, from what source did it originate?" "An anonymous letter arrived 3 days ago, making certain accusations regarding the portrait's authenticity." "Most convenient in its timing," Poirot observed mildly. "And this letter, you retain it still?" "I'm afraid I destroyed it. The accusations seemed so outrageous that I thought it best to—" "Forgive me, madame, but that was perhaps not entirely wise." His tone carried gentle reproach. In matters involving suspected deception, every piece of evidence, however seemingly insignificant, may prove valuable to the careful investigator. Inspector Bradshaw stepped forward, extending the leather portfolio. "Monsieur Poirot, we discovered these documents with the victim. Perhaps you'd care to examine them." Poirot accepted the portfolio and studied its contents with meticulous attention, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as he examined the Italian correspondence and detailed photograph. "Most illuminating indeed," he murmured. "Inspector, you have determined the precise time of death. Dr. Thornley estimates between 8:40 and 8:45, based on the body's condition when discovered. And at that time, you were all gathered here, witnessing Lady Pemberton's remarkable demonstration." We confirmed this unanimously, though Miss Fairfax added quietly, "All except poor Mr. Marsh, naturally. He remained in the library with his research materials." "Naturellement." Poirot began his characteristic pacing, hands clasped behind his back, his mind clearly engaged with the puzzle's essential elements. "So we have a young man, alone with documents that apparently cast doubt upon a valuable painting's authenticity. At the precise moment when that same painting demonstrates behavior that defies rational explanation, he meets his death. The timing, it is most curious, no?" "Surely you're not suggesting the events are connected?" protested Mr. Ashworth. "That seems rather far-fetched." "In my experience, Monsieur Ashworth, coincidence is the refuge of minds that lack imagination. When seemingly impossible events occur simultaneously, the careful investigator must consider that they may be components of a larger, more intricate design." Poirot's arrival had transformed the atmosphere entirely. Where before there had been confusion and barely controlled panic, now there was the sense that a superior intelligence had taken charge, that order would eventually emerge from chaos through the methodical application of logic and psychological insight. The little gray cells had been summoned, and the real investigation was about to. Hercule Poirot's approach to interviewing suspects was, I had long observed, rather like watching a master surgeon at work. Each question precisely calibrated, each pause deliberately timed to allow maximum revelation of character and motive. He had commandeered Lady Pemberton's morning room for his inquiries, transforming the elegant space into a theater where truth and deception would engage in their eternal performance. Inspector Bradshaw, wisely recognizing superior expertise when he encountered it, had granted Poirot considerable latitude in the proceedings. "Your methods have proven most illuminating in the past, Monsieur Poirot. I shall observe and learn." "Mais certainement, Inspector. In matters of murder, collaboration is always welcome, though the little gray cells must work in solitude." Lady Pemberton's revelations. Poirot began with our hostess, settling himself in a wing-backed chair with the unhurried precision that marked all his movements. Lady Pemberton entered with the composed dignity of one accustomed to command. Yet I detected beneath her surface calm the tension of a woman whose carefully constructed world had begun to crumble. "Madame," Poirot began conversationally, "your courage with the fire is notable. But courage, it may also be theater. Tell me of this anonymous letter and why you chose such a dramatic method of authentication." Lady Pemberton's gray eyes met his steadily. "The letter arrived 3 days ago, claiming that Mr. Blackwood had sold me a clever forgery, a modern deception designed to enrich an unscrupulous dealer. It dared me to prove the painting's authenticity, suggesting that the truth would surface tonight regardless of my actions. And yet you destroyed this letter. Most inconvenient for the investigation, n'est-ce pas?" Her smile flickered with something that might have been regret. "I found it crude and cowardly. Anonymous accusations are the weapons of those who lack conviction. I chose drama because the letter implied an audience was inevitable. Better to control the revelation than be controlled by it." "Ah, but control? It is often an illusion, madame. Tell me of the insurance upon this portrait." "Insured for its full purchase price, naturally. But a claim would require surrendering the painting to investigators. I would rather be thought a fool in public than a victim in private." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his green eyes intent. "And your nephew, Monsieur Ashworth, his financial situation, it concerns you." Reginald has always lived beyond his means, she replied carefully. He has made modest advances against his inheritance, nothing more. The portrait's value is significant, but hardly the foundation of the estate. When she departed, Poirot made a small note in his leather notebook. "Hastings," he murmured. "Observe how she speaks of control, yet her hands tremble slightly when she mentions the letter. Fear and determination, a volatile combination. The art dealer's anxiety." Mr. Silas Blackwood entered next, his nervous energy palpable as he worried constantly at his watch chain. 3 decades in the art world had not prepared him for murder investigations. "Monsieur Blackwood," Poirot began, "you have known the victim, Timothy Marsh, for how long precisely?" 3 years. He came to me straight from Cambridge. Brilliant mind for research, absolutely brilliant. I trusted him completely with the most delicate authentication work. Trust, a precious commodity in your profession. Yet it appears young Marsh had discovered something regarding the Montclair portrait that caused him considerable distress. Blackwood's face flushed. I cannot imagine what that might have been. The authentication process was exhaustive. Every test confirmed the painting's 17th century origins. Every test save one, perhaps, Poirot observed mildly. When Lady Pemberton subjected the portrait to flame, were you surprised by its remarkable resistance? Astounded. Such behavior defies every principle I've learned in 30 years. But my first concern was defending the painting's provenance. My reputation depends upon it. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. Your reputation or your financial survival? Tell me, during recent weeks, did you have any disagreements with young Marsh? Blackwood hesitated, his composure cracking. Timothy was enthusiastic, sometimes overly so. He had been pursuing certain obscure historical details about the Countess Isabella. He mentioned concerns about the Florence correspondence, but nothing that suggested fraud. Nothing. Yet the letters found with his body speak of the Montclair deception. You knew nothing of this phrase? Rumors only, Blackwood admitted reluctantly. Collectors love romantic mysteries. The idea that the portrait might conceal hidden messages or political secrets, it adds value, even if unproven. The scholar's passion. Miss Evelyn Hartwell entered with the defensive dignity of youth confronting authority, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested continued research despite the evening's tragedy. Mademoiselle, Poirot began, your expertise in Renaissance art is considerable. The phrase Montclair deception, it was not unknown to you, I think. Her cheeks flushed slightly. I had encountered whispers in various archives. The Countess Isabella's life was tumultuous. There were rumors that even her death was a carefully constructed deception to protect her political allegiances. And the portrait itself? There are certain alchemical preparations mentioned in historical texts, she said, her scholarly enthusiasm overcoming her nervousness. Experimental techniques used by a few masters to create paintings that were supposedly protected from normal processes of decay and damage. The Countess was known to patronize artists and alchemists who claimed such secret knowledge. Poirot leaned forward with interest. You speak as one who has given this matter considerable study. Perhaps more than was professionally warranted, she admitted. The Countess has been something of an obsession since my university days. A woman of power and intelligence, destroyed by those who feared her influence. Her story resonates with anyone who has struggled for recognition in academic circles. And young Marsh, he shared this passion. We corresponded about our research. He had discovered something in recent weeks that excited him greatly, but he asked me to wait until tonight to learn what it was. He said he had confided in someone who could protect him, but he wouldn't name them. The physician's clinical eye. Dr. Edmund Thornley entered with the measured tread of one accustomed to examining both the living and the dead. His medical training was evident in his precise clinical responses. Doctor, your examination of the victim revealed what, precisely? A single shot through the heart, fired at close range with what appears to have been a small-caliber pistol, almost certainly a lady's derringer, judging by the wound's characteristics. Death would have been instantaneous. And your observation of the deceased during the evening. Did anything strike you as unusual about his behavior? He seemed agitated, more so than mere academic excitement would warrant. When he spoke of his research, there was an urgency that suggested he had discovered something deeply troubling. He confided nothing specific? Only one odd comment, Thornley replied, his brow furrowing. He said that sometimes the greatest forgeries were not copies of originals, but originals masquerading as copies. Before he could elaborate, Lady Pemberton called us to witness her demonstration. The heir's concerns. Mr. Reginald Ashworth entered with the reluctant politeness of one who greets unwelcome scrutiny. His soft features and calculating eyes spoke of a man who had never worked for his living but understood its value intimately. Your aunt's theatrics tonight, they concern your inheritance considerably, do they not? Ashworth colored. I have obligations, modest advances against future inheritance, nothing more. But if the portrait proves to be a forgery, the financial implications are indeed considerable. You knew Mr. Marsh? Barely. Blackwood's assistant. Eager, ambitious. I found his enthusiasm rather tiresome, if I'm honest. And where were you when we heard the fatal shot? With the others, watching my aunt's dramatic demonstration. I was objecting rather loudly to her reckless treatment of what I hoped was a valuable artwork. The companion's observations. Miss Catherine Fairfax entered last, her quiet efficiency masking what I suspected was considerable intelligence and powers of observation. Miss Fairfax, you mentioned seeing Mr. Marsh in the library earlier, acting in a manner you described as guilty. Please elaborate. He was at Lady Pemberton's desk, examining something with great intensity. When he noticed me, he seemed startled, almost frightened. He quickly concealed whatever he was holding and pretended to be merely organizing papers. What impression did his manner give you? That he had discovered something he found deeply troubling, something that could have serious consequences. There was fear in his eyes, Monsieur Poirot, but also a kind of desperate determination. You observed nothing else of significance? Miss Fairfax hesitated. Only that he seemed to be waiting for someone. He kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the door as if expecting an important visitor. Poirot's synthesis. When the last interview concluded, Poirot remained seated, fingertips pressed together in his characteristic pose of deep contemplation. The portrait of Countess Isabella gazed down at us from the drawing room beyond, her painted eyes seeming to hold secrets that death itself could not silence. Hastings, he said finally, consider the curious elements before us. A fire that retreats from canvas, a death that advances upon truth, and a mystery that refuses to remain buried. Someone has orchestrated these events with considerable skill, but they have made one crucial error. They have underestimated the power of human psychology to reveal itself under pressure. He rose and straightened a slight wrinkle in the morning room's Persian carpet, as if even this small disorder offended his sense of proper arrangement. The little gray cells, they begin to perceive a pattern. But we must be patient. Truth, like fine wine, reveals its full character only when properly aged. The interviews had revealed a complex web of motives, secrets, and deceptions, each thread leading back to the enigmatic portrait that had somehow survived flames that should have consumed it. Yet I sensed that Poirot had detected something more, a psychological pattern that would ultimately lead us to Timothy Marsh's killer, Egan. Dawn had barely broken over Belgravia when Inspector Bradshaw returned to Lady Pemberton's residence, his weathered features bearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had untangled a complex web through methodical police work. The gray morning light filtering through the drawing-room windows seemed to strip away the previous evening's supernatural mysteries, rendering them somehow more susceptible to rational explanation. Monsieur Poirot, Bradshaw announced with evident confidence as he entered the morning room where we had assembled. I believe we have our murderer." Poirot, who had been examining the enigmatic portrait with a jeweler's loupe borrowed from Lady Pemberton's collection, looked up with polite interest. His green eyes held that particular gleam I had learned to associate with intellectual curiosity rather than satisfaction. "Indeed, Inspector, the little grey cells are most eager to hear your conclusions. The evidence points unmistakably to Mr. Silas Blackwood," Bradshaw declared, producing a leather evidence pouch from his coat. "Consider the facts methodically. He possessed the strongest motive to silence young Marsh, whose research threatened to expose the portrait as a forgery and destroy both his professional reputation and financial stability. The assembled suspects, who had been required to remain at the house overnight under police supervision, stirred uneasily. Mr. Blackwood himself had gone pale as parchment, his nervous fidgeting with his watch chain becoming almost frantic. Furthermore, Bradshaw continued, opening the evidence pouch with theatrical precision, "We discovered this concealed in Mr. Blackwood's coat pocket during our thorough search." He produced a small derringer, its pearl handle gleaming despite the morning's subdued light. A lady's weapon, precisely matching Dr. Thornley's description of what killed young Marsh. A .22 caliber, fired at close range. "Inspector," Blackwood protested, his cultured voice cracking with strain, "I have never seen that weapon before in my life. Someone must have placed it there. This is a deliberate attempt to frame an innocent man." "The cry of every guilty party since Cain discovered Abel," Bradshaw replied with professional skepticism. "Your fingerprints are on the weapon, Mr. Blackwood. Fresh prints, clearly applied recently, not the sort that accumulate from casual handling over time." Lady Pemberton observed the proceedings with the detached fascination of one watching a particularly engaging theatrical performance. "Inspector Bradshaw, while I appreciate your thoroughness, I must ask, when exactly was Mr. Blackwood supposed to have concealed this weapon? We were all together in the drawing room when the fatal shot was fired." "An excellent question, my lady, but easily resolved," Bradshaw replied confidently. "Blackwood could have secreted the weapon immediately after the murder, during the confusion when we all rushed to examine the victim's body. A man familiar with the house's layout could have disposed of evidence quickly before joining the group around poor Marsh." Dr. Thornley stroked his gray beard thoughtfully, his clinical mind engaging with the evidence. "The timeline is certainly plausible, Inspector, and I must admit, Blackwood did seem particularly agitated when we discovered the body, more so than shock alone might explain." "Precisely, Doctor. Guilt has a distinctive way of manifesting itself through nervous behavior," Bradshaw agreed. "The case appears quite straightforward. A desperate man facing professional and financial ruin eliminates the threat to his livelihood." Miss Fairfax, who had been listening from her position near the window, spoke up quietly. "If I may, Inspector, there is something that troubles me about your theory. During the evening, I observed Mr. Blackwood's hands quite carefully. He has that nervous habit with his watch chain. His hands are soft, unmarked by physical labor or violence. Yet Dr. Thornley mentioned that the shot was fired at close range, which would typically leave powder burns on the shooter's hands and clothing." Dr. Thornley nodded slowly, his medical training asserting itself. Miss Fairfax raises an excellent point. "I examined everyone's hands when checking for injuries after we discovered the body. No powder burns, no residue whatsoever on Mr. Blackwood." Poirot had remained silent throughout this exchange, his fingertips pressed together in his characteristic pose of deep contemplation. Now he stepped forward with that unhurried precision that marked all his movements. "Inspector Bradshaw," he said courteously, "your methodology is admirable, and the evidence you present appears most convincing to the casual observer. However, if you will permit me, I should like to raise several small questions before we conclude this matter." Bradshaw frowned slightly, but nodded with professional courtesy. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot, though I confess the case seems clear enough to me." "Précisément the problem," Poirot murmured, beginning his characteristic pacing. "In my considerable experience, when a case appears too clear, too perfectly arranged, it is often because someone has taken extraordinary trouble to make it appear so. He paused beside the evidence pouch, studying the derringer without touching it. Consider, if you will, the psychology of our supposed murderer. Monsieur Blackwood is a man who has spent 30 years building a reputation based upon meticulous attention to detail, careful authentication, and scrupulous business practices, n'est-ce pas? I suppose that's accurate, Bradshaw agreed reluctantly. Yet we are asked to believe that this same methodical man, having committed premeditated murder, would retain the weapon upon his person rather than disposing of it immediately. That he would leave his fingerprints upon evidence that could see him hanged. This strikes me as psychologically inconsistent with everything we know of his character. Miss Hartwell, who had been following the discussion with scholarly intensity, stepped forward. There's another inconsistency, Monsieur Poirot. The timing that Inspector Bradshaw proposes requires almost supernatural efficiency. Mr. Blackwood would have needed to slip away from our group unnoticed, locate Mr. Marsh in the library, commit murder, conceal the weapon, and return to the drawing room, all within the space of perhaps 2 minutes during Lady Pemberton's fire demonstration. An astute observation, mademoiselle, Poirot acknowledged. But there is something even more revealing. He turned to address the group with that quiet authority that commanded attention. Inspector, you mentioned that Monsieur Blackwood's fingerprints were found upon the weapon. Were there any other prints discovered? The weapon had been wiped clean except for Blackwood's prints on the handle, Bradshaw replied. Curious, Poirot mused. A murderer careful enough to wipe the weapon clean, yet careless enough to leave his own prints clearly visible. This suggests either remarkable stupidity or deliberate placement, given Monsieur Blackwood's demonstrated intelligence in business matters. Which explanation seems more probable? Mr. Ashworth, who had been listening with growing interest, stepped forward. Inspector, there's something else that troubles me about your theory. If Blackwood wanted to eliminate the threat that Marsh represented, why choose tonight in front of witnesses, during a gathering specifically designed to examine the portrait's authenticity? Surely he could have arranged a more private encounter. The anonymous letter, Lady Pemberton added suddenly, her grey eyes sharp with understanding. I received it 3 days ago, warning that the truth about the portrait would be revealed tonight. If Mr. Blackwood were planning murder to prevent exposure, why would he also ensure that exposure would occur regardless of his actions? Poirot smiled approvingly at these observations. Lady Pemberton raises the crucial point. The timing suggests that someone wanted Mr. Marsh's research to be revealed tonight, not concealed. The murder, therefore, may have been intended not to prevent revelation, but to ensure that the revelation occurred in a specific, controlled manner. He moved to examine the portrait once more, his sharp eyes noting details that escaped casual observation. There is something else, Inspector. You found the weapon in Monsieur Blackwood's coat pocket, complete with his fingerprints. But consider, if one wished to frame an innocent man for murder, what simpler method than to force him to handle the weapon, perhaps under threat, perhaps through deception, and then plant it among his possessions? Inspector Bradshaw's confidence began to waver as his neat theory unraveled under systematic scrutiny. But the motive, the opportunity, all perfectly genuine considerations. Poirot agreed, but they apply equally to several individuals present tonight. The true question is not who had motive and opportunity, but who possessed the psychological sophistication to orchestrate not merely a murder, but the subsequent investigation's direction. Dr. Thornley had been following this analysis with clinical fascination. You're suggesting, Monsieur Poirot, that someone deliberately manipulated the evidence to ensure Mr. Blackwood's arrest. I'm suggesting, Doctor, that we are dealing with a mind that anticipated exactly the sort of logical deduction that Inspector Bradshaw has demonstrated. Someone who understood that competent police work would focus on the most apparent evidence, the clearest motive, the most convenient suspect. The room fell into contemplative silence as the implications settled over our assembled group. If Poirot was correct, then the real murderer remained among us, having successfully manipulated both physical evidence and psychological expectations to cast suspicion upon an innocent man. Blackwood sagged with visible relief, though fear still haunted his eyes. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. But if I didn't kill Timothy, then who did, and why frame me specifically?" "Ah," Poirot replied, his eyes gleaming with the particular light of intellectual challenge. "Now we begin to ask the truly important questions. The little gray cells suggest that this entire evening, the anonymous letter, the dramatic fire test, the murder itself, and now this convenient arrest, was carefully choreographed by someone who understood human psychology with considerable sophistication." He returned once more to the portrait of Countess Isabella, whose painted eyes seemed to observe our deliberations with enigmatic amusement. "The answer lies not in obvious motives or conveniently planted evidence, but in understanding why someone wanted us to witness the impossible. A portrait that refuses to burn, and a murder that refuses to conform to logical explanation." Inspector Bradshaw reluctantly pocketed his handcuffs, his professional pride clearly wounded, but his respect for Poirot's methods intact. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot. If Blackwood isn't our murderers, then where do we look next?" Poirot straightened a slightly askew ornament on the mantelpiece with fastidious care, as if even this small disorder offended his sense of proper arrangement. "We look, Inspector, at the one element that everyone has accepted without question, the portrait itself. For I begin to suspect that Countess Isabella's secrets are not buried in the 17th century, but very much alive in our present circumstances. The first false lead had been exposed and dismissed, but rather than bringing us closer to resolution, Poirot's intervention had revealed that we were confronting a mind far more cunning and psychologically sophisticated than any of us had initially suspected. The real game, it seemed, was only beginning, and the stakes were higher than mere questions of artistic authenticity or professional reputation. As I watched Poirot return to his examination of the mysterious portrait, I could not shake the feeling that Countess Isabella herself was somehow orchestrating events from beyond the grave, her painted eyes holding secrets that had already cost one life and might yet claim others before the truth finally emerged. It was mid-morning when Hercule Poirot began what I have come to recognize as his most delicate and dangerous phase of investigation, the period in which he plants carefully chosen remarks, like seeds in fertile ground, then waits for human nature to provide him with a harvest of revelation. The dismissal of the case against Mr. Blackwood had transformed the drawing room from a scene of resolved tension into something far more unsettling. A psychological battlefield where the true murderer remained hidden among us, their sophisticated mind now fully engaged in a deadly game of intellectual chess. Poirot had arranged the room to his exacting satisfaction, chairs positioned at precise angles to encourage both observation and discomfort. The enigmatic portrait tilted slightly to catch the morning light. Even the coal scuttle moved closer to the grate than strict practicality demanded. "Order, Hastings," he murmured as he made these adjustments, "is the ally of truth, while disorder serves as camouflage for deception. The art of psychological pressure." "Mes amis," Poirot announced to our assembled company, his voice carrying that quiet authority which commanded absolute attention, "we have established that the obvious solution was incorrect. Now we must consider what the little gray cells whisper about human psychology and the true art of sophisticated deception." He positioned himself before the fireplace, where Countess Isabella's portrait continued to dominate our attention, her painted eyes seeming to observe the proceedings with enigmatic amusement. "The murder of young Timothy Marsh was not a crime of passion or desperation," he continued, allowing his penetrating green gaze to sweep across each face in turn. "It was, instead, a carefully orchestrated performance designed not merely to eliminate a threat, but to manipulate the subsequent investigation in a most specific direction. Lady Pemberton, maintaining her composed dignity despite the morning's revelations, adjusted her position slightly. "You speak as if the murderer anticipated your involvement, Monsieur Poirot. That suggests considerable knowledge of your methods." "Précisément, madame. The entire evening's events demonstrate intimate familiarity with both my investigative approach and the psychological profiles of everyone present." He began his characteristic pacing, hands clasped behind his back. Consider the sequence. An anonymous letter arrives exactly 3 days before tonight's gathering, warning of revelations to come. The timing ensures maximum dramatic impact while providing insufficient opportunity for thorough counter-investigation. The science of small observations. At 11 o'clock, Poirot contrived what appeared to be a simple tea service, though I had learned never to underestimate the significance of his seemingly casual arrangements. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured as Hargreaves distributed the delicate china cups, "how people reveal themselves through their manner of touching what is hot." The exercise proved illuminating in ways that only Poirot's trained eye could fully appreciate. Lady Pemberton grasped her cup with steady confidence, her hands betraying no tremor despite the morning's stress. Miss Fairfax employed the saucer's rim to avoid direct contact with the heated porcelain, the careful habit of one accustomed to managing practical details. Miss Hartwell, absorbed in scholarly contemplation, touched the cup directly and winced at the unexpected heat. Dr. Thornley cooled his tea with measured puffs of breath, applying scientific method even to refreshment. Mr. Ashworth rapped the handle with his napkin, displaying the cautious nature of one who had learned to avoid unnecessary risk. Mr. Blackwood's hand trembled visibly despite his attempted smile, the lingering effects of his recent ordeal still evident in his nervous system. "The Derringer," Poirot mentioned casually as the tea was consumed, addressing no one in particular yet ensuring everyone heard, "is a most sentimental weapon, n'est-ce pas? A keepsake, a trinket, often presented as a gift, seldom fired in anger. Many a lady keeps such a thing in a velvet-lined case, secured with a tiny key." He drifted away from the subject as smoothly as smoke dispersing, but not before I observed Miss Fairfax glance almost imperceptibly at the small reticule she carried, while Lady Pemberton's grey eyes remained perfectly steady. The contemporary deception. "I have been most fortunate," Poirot continued after a carefully calculated pause, "to examine more closely the nature of the anonymous letter that precipitated last night's melodrama. This was not, to my knowledge, entirely accurate, but Poirot had been known to manufacture strategic prophecies to provoke revealing reactions. There is a phrase, 'the beautiful lie,' that appears to have been emphasized. It interests me greatly, for it is the chosen expression of someone who admires elegance even in the practice of deception. The responses were subtle but telling. Dr. Thornley's brows contracted in thought. Mr. Ashworth shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Blackwood swallowed with visible difficulty. Lady Pemberton smiled with sudden brightness, and Miss Hartwell's lips parted as if to speak, before closing again in careful silence. Miss Hartwell, her scholarly enthusiasm overcoming her caution, leaned forward. "Monsieur Poirot, you mentioned contemporary secrets hidden behind historical mysteries. But the Countess Isabella died over 2 centuries ago. What contemporary relevance could her story possibly possess? Consider, mademoiselle, that the most effective historical deceptions are those that serve present purposes." Poirot replied, his sharp eyes noting every micro-expression. What if the portrait's mysterious properties and romantic provenance were deliberately cultivated to conceal its true significance in current circumstances? Young Marsh discovered something that threatened someone's carefully constructed plans. But rather than eliminating him quietly, our murderer chose to transform his death into part of a larger performance. The physical evidence speaks. Poirot moved to examine the portrait more closely, producing a small hand mirror from his waistcoat pocket. With almost comic delicacy, he held it parallel to the painting's surface. "Observe, mes amis, how the line of reflection reveals certain irregularities. There is a plane, And upon that plane, a second plane. He tapped the frame with a fingernail, producing an oddly bright note, most illuminating indeed. When Hargreaves was summoned to discuss the previous evening's fire preparation, his responses proved more revealing than anticipated. The grate had been laid early with coal, then wood arranged by Miss Fairfax's specific direction to improve the draught. At Lady Pemberton's request, a small tin of Italian resin had been employed for 2 nights running, something sent by the Florence dealer to revive the perfume of old varnish. "It does not burn as common pine, sir," Hargreaves added with his characteristic precision. "There is a distinct tang to the smoke. Metallic, one might say." Poirot thanked him gravely and requested that the coal scuttle not be replenished for the remainder of the day. The reconstruction. In the library, Poirot staged what he termed a small reconstruction of possibilities. He timed the distance from drawing room to desk, accounting for the astonishment at the portrait's fire resistance, the rush to the corridor, and the inevitable bottleneck at the doorway. You perceive, Hastings, for someone to leave unseen and return unseen demands not mere haste, but careful planning and intimate knowledge of human behavior. Stooping beside a book trolley, he extracted a small wedge of cork from beneath its runners. A door, once propped open, will close at precisely the moment chosen by whoever removes the morning light filtering through Lady Pemberton's drawing-room windows, seemed to strip away the previous evening's supernatural mysteries, rendering the assembled company more susceptible to the penetrating analysis that Hercule Poirot was about to unleash. With the convenient theory of Mr. Blackwood's guilt thoroughly demolished, Poirot began what I had come to recognize as one of his most delicate and dangerous maneuvers: the psychological provocation of a murderer who believed themselves safely concealed among the innocent. "Mes amis," Poirot announced, settling himself in a chair positioned to observe all the assembled suspects. "We shall conduct a small experiment in human nature. For the little gray cells, they tell me that our murderer possesses a mind of considerable sophistication, someone who thinks not merely one move ahead, but several moves simultaneously, like a true chess master." He gestured toward a small table where Hargreaves had arranged several items at his request: 6 plain envelopes, writing materials, and a crystal decanter of water. Each of you will participate in a simple exercise. You will take an envelope, write upon a card the single word "truth," fold it, and return it to me. Voila, a childish exercise, n'est-ce pas? Yet the hand, it betrays the mind in ways that words cannot conceal. Lady Pemberton raised an eyebrow with aristocratic curiosity, but complied first, her movements displaying the composed efficiency of one accustomed to command. Mr. Blackwood's pen scratched with nervous eagerness, his relief at avoiding arrest still palpable. Dr. Thornley formed his letters with clinical precision, while Miss Hartwell wrote with scholarly care, though I detected a slight tremor at the word's conclusion. Mr. Ashworth fussed over his penmanship with the attention to detail of one who had never worked for his living, and Miss Fairfax completed the task with quiet, unassuming efficiency. Poirot collected the envelopes without opening them, his green eyes noting every subtle reaction, every unconscious gesture. Merci. Now, I ask each of you to approach the portrait and describe, in one sentence only, what you perceive in the Countess Isabella's expression. Imagine you encounter her gaze in a shadowed corridor at twilight. The responses revealed as much about the speakers as about the painted subject. Lady Pemberton, amused contempt for those who lack her courage. Mr. Blackwood, calculating assessment of everyone's worth and weakness. Dr. Thornley, clinical observation as if diagnosing hidden ailments. Miss Hartwell, defiant intelligence, a woman who refused to be silenced. Mr. Ashworth, mercenary charm designed to extract maximum advantage. Miss Fairfax, a warning to those perceptive enough to understand her message. Fascinating, Poirot murmured, making careful notes. You show me not the Countess, but the mirrors of your own souls. He moved to the fireplace, where the ashes from the previous evening's dramatic demonstration had been carefully preserved. "Hargreaves, if you please, bring me a small dish of these ashes and some water." When the mixture was prepared, Poirot stirred it delicately and moved among the suspects, inviting each to detect any unusual odor. Notice the metallic scent. It suggests the presence of certain chemical compounds, alum, borax, phosphates, substances that can retard combustion when properly applied to canvas and paint. The reaction was immediate and telling. Mr. Blackwood recoiled slightly, his face showing genuine surprise. Miss Hartwell leaned forward with scholarly interest, while Dr. Thornley's medical training engaged with the chemical implications. Most significantly, I observed that one member of our group showed no surprise whatsoever at this revelation, as if they had expected exactly such a discovery. "The portrait's resistance to flame," Poirot continued conversationally, "was not supernatural, but scientific. Someone with considerable knowledge of historical chemistry applied treatments that would create precisely the dramatic effect we witnessed. But such expertise is rare indeed, requiring not merely artistic knowledge, but understanding of both historical techniques and modern applications." He began his characteristic pacing, hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the psychological profile of our murderer, mes amis. They orchestrated not merely a killing, but an entire theatrical performance designed to manipulate our perceptions and reactions. The anonymous letter that forced Lady Pemberton's hand, the timing of the murder during maximum distraction, the careful planting of evidence to implicate an innocent man, all suggest a mind that derives satisfaction from demonstrating intellectual superiority. The psychological pressure was mounting visibly. Lady Pemberton's aristocratic composure showed hairline cracks of strain. Dr. Thornley's clinical detachment seemed forced, as if he were concentrating on maintaining professional demeanor. Even Miss Fairfax's quiet efficiency appeared studied, as though she were performing rather than simply being herself. "But perhaps most revealing," Poirot added with relentless precision, "is our murderers' need to witness their handiwork. They could have eliminated Mr. Marsh quietly, privately, without drama or investigation. Instead, they chose to kill him here, surrounded by witnesses and inevitable scrutiny. This suggests someone who enjoys the game as much as the victory, who views murder not as a regrettable necessity, but as the ultimate demonstration of their intellectual supremacy." Miss Hartwell stood abruptly, her scholarly composure finally showing strain. "Monsieur Poirot, these psychological theories are fascinating, but surely we need concrete evidence rather than speculation about the murderer's character." "Ah, but mademoiselle," Poirot replied with gentle reproach, "in matters of murder, psychology is often the most concrete evidence available. The human mind cannot entirely conceal its true nature, even when it believes itself perfectly disguised." He returned once more to the portrait, studying the painted features with renewed intensity. "Our murderer has created a historical parallel, perhaps unconsciously. The Countess Isabella was destroyed by those who feared her knowledge and independence. Young Timothy Marsh met the same fate for the same reason. He possessed knowledge that someone found intolerable." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Somewhere among our assembled company, a murderer was calculating their next move with the desperate cunning of a cornered predator. The psychological game had been engaged, and the pressure was beginning to show its effects in subtle but unmistakable ways. "The little gray cells," Poirot concluded quietly, "suggest that such pressure will soon compel our murderer to make another move, and when they do, they will reveal themselves through the very psychological sophistication they believe protects them." Chapter 7. Another crime or major reveal, the scholar's discovery. The afternoon had progressed with the oppressive weight of a gathering storm when the second catastrophe struck with sudden, terrifying violence. Miss Hartwell had excused herself from our tense gathering to retrieve some research materials from Lady Pemberton's library, where she had been granted permission to examine certain historical documents. Her scholarly enthusiasm had seemed to provide welcome relief from the mounting psychological pressure of Poirot's investigation. It was Miss Fairfax who discovered the tragedy, her usually composed demeanor shattered by what she had witnessed. She burst into the drawing room, her face ashen with shock and her hands trembling as she struggled to form coherent words. "Monsieur Poirot," she gasped, "something terrible has happened to Miss Hartwell. She's been attacked, struck down in the library, but she's alive, barely conscious, and she's trying to tell me something about the portrait." We rushed immediately to the library, where we found Miss Hartwell sprawled beside the massive mahogany desk, a thin trickle of blood seeping from a wound on her temple. Dr. Thornley assumed command with professional efficiency, his medical training overriding all other considerations as he knelt to examine her injuries. "Conscious but disoriented," he reported grimly. "Someone struck her with considerable force. This candlestick, I believe." He indicated a heavy silver piece lying nearby, its base stained with blood. "She's fortunate to be alive." Inspector Bradshaw secured the scene while Poirot examined the library with his characteristic thoroughness. Books had been pulled from shelves, papers scattered across the desk, and a small wooden box lay overturned on the Persian carpet, its contents spilled across the floor, several old documents, a pressed flower, and a miniature portrait no larger than a locket. "Miss Hartwell," Poirot said gently, positioning himself where she could see him without strain, "can you tell us what happened?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her scholarly determination overcame her physical weakness. "I found something, Monsieur Poirot, something extraordinary about the portrait. I was examining the historical documents when someone entered behind me. I turned, and then darkness." "What did you discover, mademoiselle?" With Dr. Thornley's assistance, she struggled to sit upright, her eyes blazing with the excitement of academic discovery despite her injuries. "I found a journal, a 17th century account by a French diplomat who visited the Montclair estate in 1690, just 1 year before the Countess's supposed death. He wrote that the portrait was remarkable not for its artistic merit, but because it contained what he called the key to the Countess's greatest secret." The implications sent a visible tremor through our assembled group. Lady Pemberton leaned forward with intense interest, while Mr. Blackwood's face showed a mixture of fascination and professional concern. "The diplomat wrote," Miss Hartwell continued, her voice growing stronger with scholarly enthusiasm, "that the portrait had been painted using special techniques that would reveal hidden messages when subjected to specific conditions. The Countess had told him the portrait would speak truth when touched by flame, but only to those who possessed the wisdom to understand its language." "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, his green eyes blazing with intellectual excitement. "You have uncovered something of extraordinary significance. But clearly, someone wished to prevent you from sharing this information." "There's more," she said urgently. "Hidden in the journal's binding, I discovered a letter from the Countess Isabella herself, written shortly before her supposed death. She revealed that she had uncovered evidence of a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of the French court, evidence that she had concealed within her portrait using techniques learned from an Italian alchemist." Mr. Ashworth stepped forward, his financial concerns momentarily forgotten. "Are you suggesting that the portrait actually contains hidden information? Some sort of coded message?" "More than a message," Miss Hartwell replied, her academic excitement overcoming her physical discomfort. "According to the Countess's letter, the portrait contains the location of documents that could have toppled governments and destroyed powerful families. She wrote that she had faked her own death to escape those who sought to silence her, and that the portrait would serve as a guide for those who came after her. The revelation transformed our understanding entirely. If Miss Hartwell's research was accurate, then the portrait represented something far more valuable than mere artwork. It was a treasure map leading to secrets that had been hidden for over 2 centuries. But why attack Miss Hartwell now? Dr. Thornley asked, his medical examination complete. If this information has been hidden for centuries, why the sudden urgency? Poirot began his characteristic pacing, his mind clearly racing to integrate this new information with his existing theories. Because, Doctor, someone else has discovered the portrait's true significance. Timothy Marsh's research must have uncovered the same historical connections. His murder was not about preventing the exposure of a forgery. It was about protecting a secret far more valuable and dangerous. Then the anonymous letter, Lady Pemberton said slowly, understanding dawning in her gray eyes. The challenge to test the portrait with fire. Someone wanted to activate whatever mechanism the Countess built into the painting. Précisément, Madame. But they needed a witness, someone whose word would be accepted regarding the portrait's behavior. They manipulated you into conducting the test publicly, ensuring that the portrait's resistance to flame would be documented and believed. Inspector Bradshaw had been following this discussion with growing concern. But if the portrait contains hidden information, why hasn't our murderer simply stolen it and decoded its secrets privately? An excellent question, Inspector, Poirot replied, approvingly. The answer suggests that our murderer lacks either the knowledge or the resources to decode the portrait's secrets alone. They need cooperation, perhaps specific expertise, perhaps access to additional historical documents, perhaps simply the legitimacy that comes from conducting research openly rather than through theft. Miss Hartwell, despite her injuries, managed to retrieve one of the scattered documents from the floor. There's something else, Monsieur Poirot. The letter mentions that the portrait's secrets can only be revealed through a specific sequence of actions. Fire was merely the first step. The Countess wrote that those who would claim her legacy must prove themselves worthy through trials of flame, water, and shadow. Trials? Lady Pemberton asked, her voice carrying a note of apprehension. The fire test was only the beginning, Miss Hartwell explained weakly. According to the Countess's instructions, the portrait must be subjected to additional treatments, each designed to reveal different layers of hidden information. But the process is dangerous. One wrong step could destroy the painting and its secrets forever. Poirot's expression grew grave as he contemplated the implications. Then our murderer faces a dilemma, n'est-ce pas? They need the portrait's secrets, but they lack the knowledge to safely extract them. They require expert assistance, yet they cannot trust anyone with such valuable information. Which explains, Dr. Thornley observed with clinical insight, why they haven't simply fled with the painting. They need us, or at least they need our expertise and resources. The attack on Miss Hartwell had revealed that we were dealing with someone far more dangerous than a mere art forger or opportunistic killer. The stakes involved centuries-old secrets that could still have devastating consequences in the modern world. And somewhere among our assembled company, a murderer was growing increasingly desperate as their carefully laid plans began to unravel under the pressure of Poirot's investigation. Hastings, Poirot murmured as Dr. Thornley helped Miss Hartwell to a more comfortable position. Observe how our murderer's behavior has evolved. The first crime was calculated and precise, designed to appear as part of a larger deception. This attack was desperate, impulsive, the action of someone who feels control slipping away. What does that suggest about their next move? I asked. Poirot's expression grew deeply troubled as he studied the portrait of Countess Isabella, whose painted eyes seemed to hold secrets that had already claimed 2 victims. It suggests, mon ami, that they will soon be forced into their most dangerous gambit yet. For if they cannot safely extract the portrait's secrets, they may decide that no one else should have the opportunity to do so either. The afternoon light was fading rapidly, casting long shadows across the library's scattered evidence of violence and discovery. The game had entered its most perilous phase, with a murderer who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect secrets buried for centuries. The portrait's mysteries were finally beginning to emerge, but at a cost that continued to rise with each passing hour. As we prepared to move Miss Hartwell to more comfortable quarters, I could not escape the feeling that the Countess Isabella herself was somehow orchestrating events from beyond the grave, her painted eyes holding secrets that would demand still more sacrifices before they were finally revealed. The trials of flame, water, and shadow awaited, and somewhere among us lurked someone willing to kill to ensure they all. The attack upon Miss Hartwell had transformed the investigation from methodical inquiry into urgent necessity. As the October storm gathered strength outside Lady Pemberton's windows, Hercule Poirot stood before the portrait of Countess Isabella with the concentrated intensity of a master craftsman approaching his most challenging puzzle. The revelation of hidden trials, flame, water, and shadow had elevated our mystery beyond simple murder into the realm of historical conspiracy. Yet I sensed that Poirot had detected something crucial that had escaped the rest of us entirely. "Hastings," he said quietly, adjusting the position of a lamp with characteristic precision. "We shall conduct our own trials, but with the patience that our murderer lacks. Order, mon ami. We restore order to the room and to the mind." He had requested the drawing room to himself, with only my presence permitted and Hargreaves attending at intervals. The portrait had been carefully repositioned to catch the changing light, and Poirot had assembled an array of materials that spoke to both scientific methodology and artistic expertise. A spirit lamp with kettle, fresh blotting papers, a jeweler's loupe, and several mirrors of varying sizes. The fire test revealed the portrait's resistance to flame, he continued, lighting the spirit lamp with deliberate care. But what if that dramatic demonstration served not merely to prove authenticity, but to initiate a process far more subtle? He guided a gentle veil of steam across a corner of the painting, no more than the lace at the Countess's wrist and the darker ground beyond, interposing blotting paper to draw away condensation with each pass. Steam only, mon ami. Caresses, not assaults. Note how the varnish blooms ever so slightly. A surface that has been reworked will confess under moisture. It is the conscience of the paint. Through his jeweler's loupe, Poirot breathed an appreciative "ah" and repositioned a second lamp. Shadow grazed the surface at a low raking angle, causing the painted texture to spring into relief like terrain on a map. He traced, not with a finger, but with the tip of a sable brush held an inch from the canvas, a minute succession of points that gleamed and then disappeared under normal light. "Pinpricks," he said softly. "Not of the 17th century. They pierced the upper varnish only. No cracking, no oxidation around the holes. Recent, they align like stars in a constellation. 13, 14, 15. He smiled to himself, the smile of a man to whom a stubborn lock had whispered its secret. As he worked, the storm outside intensified, and I noticed something remarkable occurring. The increasing humidity in the room, combined with the residual effects of the previous evening's heat treatment, was causing subtle changes in the portrait's appearance. Faint markings began to emerge in areas where Poirot's steam had touched the canvas. Not painted details, but variations in the surface itself, as if invisible ink were slowly developing under our observation. "Mon Dieu," I breathed, leaning closer. "There are letters appearing, Latin text, though badly faded." "Précisément, Hastings. The Countess Isabella, with her Italian alchemist's assistance, created a portrait that responds to environmental conditions in ways invisible until proper circumstances arose." He gestured toward the storm-lashed windows. "The chemical compounds I detected in the ashes, iron oxide, copper sulfate, react not merely to heat, but to changes in humidity and atmospheric pressure." The emerging text was fragmentary but tantalizing. Sub rosa, veritas, and what appeared to be coordinates or measurements. Most significantly, the date 1691 appeared clearly, the year of the Countess's supposed death. But there is more, Poirot continued, moving to Lady Pemberton's writing desk. Hargreaves, if you please, bring me the blotter from the library, the large leather one with the green leaf inlay. When the blotter arrived, Poirot laid it upon the desk with surgical care. Taking a soft pencil, he held it flat and gently darkened the surface. As if summoned by magic, letters formed from the microscopic valleys in the paper. Slanted, tidy, economical handwriting that had pressed through from documents above. "The ghosts of words," he murmured, studying the impressions. "They are often chattier than their living cousins." The revealed text appeared to be a list of chemical compounds and measurements, precise instructions for the water trial that Miss Hartwell had mentioned. It was at this moment that we were interrupted by the return of our suspects from their various quarters. Lady Pemberton entered with Miss Fairfax, the latter's composure restored, though I noticed upon her right glove a faint chalkiness, as if she had handled powders or dried paste. When she folded her hands, a tiny white ghost fell upon the carpet and vanished. Poirot observed this detail with the keen attention he devoted to all anomalies. "Mademoiselle," he said pleasantly, "you have been helpful beyond your duty. Might I beg of you 5 minutes later to speak of household arrangements, the ash disposal, the cleaning of the grate, the polishes used?" Miss Fairfax's gaze remained steady. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. We pride ourselves on careful housekeeping." "Care," he murmured, "is a virtue that sometimes leaves traces." Dr. Thornley appeared, having completed his examination of Miss Hartwell's injuries. In his hands was the silver candlestick that had been used in the attack. He sniffed at its base, frowning, then caught Poirot's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Poirot acknowledged this silent communication with a fractional nod, as though a private conversation had been satisfactorily concluded. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said, drawing me aside as the others dispersed. "We speak softly now. The murderer listens to all that is said, and even more closely to what is not." "You've found something significant," I observed. He patted his pocketbook where he had carefully preserved the blotter impressions. "I have found several elements that together become une petite musique. The pricked stars in the varnish, modern, precise, in a pattern meaningful to those versed in certain disciplines. The behavior of the varnish under moisture, suggesting specific resins not easily obtained. The chemical composition revealing a multi-stage process. The ghost of instructions in a careful hand. And most eloquent of all, the reaction, or rather non-reaction, of one person when I named the compounds." "Which person?" "The one who wished above all not to appear surprised," he replied serenely. "That is quite different from being genuinely calm." The implications were staggering. Our murderer possessed not only detailed knowledge of the portrait's history, but understanding of the specific chemical processes required to unlock its secrets. The pinprick constellation, the precise measurements on the blotter, the technical knowledge evident in every aspect of the scheme, all pointed to someone with both historical expertise and scientific training. Timothy Marsh discovered this sequence through his authentication work, Poirot continued. His photographic documentation under various light spectra revealed the hidden patterns. Miss Hartwell's historical research provided the context, the trials of flame, water, and shadow. Together, they possessed the complete key to the Countess's legacy. And the murderer needed both pieces of the puzzle, I realized. Exactment. They eliminated Marsh to prevent him from sharing his discovery, then attacked Miss Hartwell to seize her research, but they underestimated the power of academic thoroughness. Both victims had documented their findings extensively. Thunder crashed overhead, and the portrait seemed to shimmer in the uncertain light. The chemical processes Poirot had identified were continuing to develop, slowly revealing more of the Countess Isabella's encoded message with each passing hour. "The storm provides ideal conditions," Poirot observed with satisfaction. By morning, we should have access to whatever secrets the Countess encoded within her masterpiece 3 centuries ago. But our murderer knows this as well. They will be compelled to act tonight before the revelation becomes complete and public. He moved to examine the emerging text once more, his expression growing grave. The little gray cells suggest that these secrets pose a direct threat to someone in this very room. Someone whose family history or personal circumstances would be devastated by the emergence of 17th century political conspiracies. As if summoned by his words, lightning illuminated the drawing room, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the house's foundations. The portrait flickered in the uncertain light, the Countess's painted eyes holding secrets that had already claimed 2 victims and promised to demand more before dawn. "Hastings," Poirot murmured as we prepared for what I sensed would be a long and dangerous night. "We have brushed the sleeve of truth. Soon we shall take its hand. But first, we must survive the desperate gambit of a killer who has run out of time and options." The hidden clue had been revealed through patient observation and scientific methodology. Not dramatic deduction alone, but the careful application of both historical knowledge and chemical understanding. Yet rather than bringing us closer to safety, Poirot's discoveries had elevated the danger to unprecedented levels. The portrait's secrets were emerging from their centuries-old concealment, but the price of revelation continued to rise with each flash of lightning and crash of thunder. The game was approaching its climax, and somewhere in the storm-lashed darkness, a murderer was preparing for their final, most desperate move. One would claim the Countess's deadly legacy. The storm that had been gathering throughout the evening reached its crescendo as midnight approached, transforming Lady Pemberton's elegant drawing room into a theater where centuries-old secrets would finally demand their due. Lightning illuminated the assembled company with stroboscopic intensity, while thunder provided a dramatic counterpoint to what would prove to be Hercule Poirot's most intricate revelation. He had arranged the room with characteristic precision, chairs positioned in a careful semicircle, the portrait of Countess Isabella mounted on an easel where the storm's atmospheric effects continued their chemical revelation, and a small table bearing the instruments of scientific inquiry, distilled water, sable brushes, and carefully folded linen. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the storm's fury with quiet authority. "We gather to resolve a puzzle that has claimed 2 victims and threatens to claim more before dawn. But first, we must understand that we have been participants in a performance orchestrated with extraordinary sophistication, a drama where each of us has played a role scripted by a mind of remarkable cunning." Inspector Bradshaw positioned himself near the door, 2 constables flanking him with the professional alertness of men who had learned to expect the unexpected when Hercule Poirot conducted his final gatherings. The assembled suspects, Lady Pemberton maintaining her aristocratic composure despite visible strain, Mr. Blackwood still pale from his narrow escape from false accusation, Dr. Thornley observing with clinical detachment, Mr. Ashworth fidgeting with barely concealed anxiety, Miss Hartwell bandaged but resolute on her chaise, and Miss Fairfax maintaining her characteristic quiet efficiency, waited with the tense anticipation of actors awaiting their cues. The scientific revelation, Poirot, moved to the portrait, where the storm's humidity had continued the chemical processes he had initiated earlier. We begin with the mystery that defied rational explanation. A portrait that refused to burn, flames that retreated from canvas as if repelled by supernatural forces. Yet science, mes amis, explains all mysteries for those patient enough to apply proper methodology. He lifted a sable brush, dipped it in distilled water, and with surgical precision applied the faintest moisture to a section of the painting's background. The assembled company leaned forward as faint lines began to emerge, at first like bruises upon the paint, then resolving into brownish script that seemed to write itself across the canvas. "Gall ink," Dr. Thornley murmured with professional recognition. "Iron-based compounds that react to moisture after centuries of dormancy." précisément, Doctor, but observe the precision of the application. Poirot adjusted a lamp to create raking light across the portrait surface. The pinpricks I discovered earlier, 13, 14, 15 points of light that form constellations when properly illuminated, serve as guides for the precise application of moisture. Someone with intimate knowledge of both historical chemistry and modern conservation techniques prepared this portrait to reveal its secrets through a specific sequence of environmental conditions. The emerging text was fragmentary but tantalizing. Latin phrases intertwined with French, sub rosa, veritas, coordinates rendered in 17th century measurements, and most significantly, what appeared to be genealogical notations spanning from 1691 to the present day, the psychological web. But the portrait's chemical mysteries are merely the surface of a far more complex deception, Poirot continued, beginning his characteristic pacing. Consider the orchestration of events. An anonymous letter arrives precisely 3 days before a gathering, specifically designed to examine the portrait's authenticity. This letter challenged Lady Pemberton's courage and intelligence, knowing that she would respond with characteristic directness rather than patient investigation. Lady Pemberton's grey eyes flashed with understanding and perhaps a touch of wounded pride. "You're suggesting that someone manipulated me into conducting the fire test?" "I'm stating it as established fact, madame. Someone who understood your psychology intimately enough to predict your response to such a challenge. The fire test was not a spontaneous act of defiance. It was the opening movement of a carefully choreographed symphony of deception." Poirot paused beside the evidence table, where the blotter impressions he had discovered revealed their ghostly secrets. Young Timothy Marsh, through his meticulous photographic analysis under various light spectra, had begun to unravel the portrait's dual nature as both artwork and cipher. His research revealed the chemical treatments that created the fire resistance, the hidden text that emerged under specific conditions, and most dangerously, the historical connections that linked the Countess Isabella's legacy to present circumstances. The pattern of murder. The murder itself demonstrates the psychological sophistication of our killer. Poirot continued, his green eyes noting every subtle reaction among the assembled suspects. Timothy Marsh was eliminated at the precise moment when Lady Pemberton's dramatic demonstration provided maximum distraction. The timing was not coincidental. It was calculated to ensure that the fatal shot would be masked by the crackling of flames and the gasps of amazed witnesses. Miss Hartwell, despite her injuries, leaned forward with scholarly intensity. But why kill Timothy at all? If the murderer wanted access to his research, surely there were less dramatic methods. An excellent question, mademoiselle. The answer reveals the true sophistication of our killer's psychology. Timothy Marsh possessed half of the key to the Countess's legacy, the scientific methodology for revealing the portrait's secrets. But he lacked the historical context that your research provided. Our murderer needed both halves of the puzzle, but they also needed to control the timing and circumstances of the revelation. Poirot moved to examine the portrait once more, where additional text had emerged during their discussion. The attack upon you, Miss Hartwell, was born of desperation rather than calculation. When you discovered the diplomat's journal and the Countess's own letter describing the trials of flame, water, and shadow, you possessed the missing piece of the puzzle. Our murderer struck impulsively, abandoning their previous precision for the urgent necessity of seizing your research. The web of deception. But there is more, Poirot added, his voice growing grave as he studied the emerging genealogical notations. The Countess Isabella encoded more than political secrets within her masterpiece. She documented evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into our present day, financial arrangements, political intelligence, and most significantly, a family lineage that has survived through 3 centuries of European upheaval. The implications sent a visible tremor through the assembled company. Dr. Thornley's clinical composure showed the first signs of strain, while Mr. Ashworth's financial concerns seemed suddenly trivial in comparison to the historical revelations unfolding before them. The murderer is someone who possesses not merely knowledge of art and chemistry, but intimate understanding of the historical connections that link the 17th century to our present circumstances. Poirot continued relentlessly. They needed the portrait's secrets not for financial gain alone, but to control information that could transform their entire existence or destroy it completely. The psychological profile. Lightning crashed overhead as Poirot turned to face the assembled suspects directly. Our murderer demonstrates a mind that thinks not merely one move ahead, but several moves simultaneously, like a true chess master. They anticipated the police investigation's focus on obvious motives and convenient evidence. They prepared false clues, the planted weapon, the manipulated timeline, knowing that competent investigators would initially follow the most apparent leads. He paused, allowing his gaze to sweep over each individual with penetrating intensity. But they made one crucial error, born of intellectual pride. They believed themselves clever enough to direct not only our eyes, but our thoughts. They underestimated the power of psychological observation combined with scientific methodology. Miss Fairfax, who had maintained her characteristic quiet composure throughout the evening's revelations, shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair. The movement was subtle, a straightening of posture, a slight lifting of the chin, but it spoke of someone preparing to abandon a role they had played for too long. The little gray cells perceive a pattern, Poirot concluded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Someone among us has demonstrated intimate knowledge of this household's routines, access to the portrait for the chemical preparations, understanding of both historical research and modern conservation techniques, and most tellingly, the psychological sophistication to orchestrate not merely a murder, but the entire investigation's direction. The moment of truth. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself were holding its breath for the final revelation. The portrait of Countess Isabella gazed down at the assembled company, her painted eyes holding secrets that had already claimed 2 victims and promised to demand more before the truth was finally revealed. In the morning light, Poirot announced with quiet finality, when the storm has passed and the portrait's chemical revelation is complete, we shall see the full extent of the Countess Isabella's legacy. But tonight, we have learned enough to understand that her descendant walks among us, someone who has honored her ancestors' memory through murder and deception, believing themselves the rightful heir to secrets that have shaped European history. He straightened a slight irregularity in the carpet with characteristic fastidiousness, as if even this small disorder offended his sense of proper arrangement. The trials of flame, water, and shadow were designed not merely to reveal secrets, but to ensure that only someone with both the knowledge and the ruthless determination of the Countess Isabella herself could claim her legacy. The final gathering had achieved its purpose. The web of deception had been systematically unraveled, the psychological patterns exposed, and the murderer's sophisticated methodology laid bare. Yet the ultimate revelation remained tantalizingly close, suspended in the electric atmosphere of the storm-lashed drawing room where past and present had finally converged in a deadly confrontation that would demand one final, desperate gambit before dawn could bring resolution to the affair of the portrait that refused to burn. As lightning illuminated the room once more, I could not escape the feeling that the Countess Isabella herself was orchestrating this final act from beyond the grave, her painted eyes holding the promise that justice, like truth, would ultimately emerge from the shadows where it had been hidden for 3 centuries. The storm outside had reached its crescendo, but within Lady Pemberton's drawing room, a deeper stillness descended, the profound quiet that precedes the final movement of a complex symphony. Hercule Poirot stood before the portrait of Countess Isabella, where the combined effects of atmospheric pressure and his careful chemical treatments had continued their revelatory work. The hidden text now formed intricate patterns across the canvas. Latin phrases intertwined with French, genealogical notations, and what appeared to be detailed financial records spanning 3 centuries of European upheaval. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the thunder with quiet authority. "We have reached the moment when order must be restored to chaos, when truth must emerge from the shadows where it has been concealed by murder and deception. The portrait that refused to burn was never a miracle. It was science in the service of secrecy, orchestrated by a mind of extraordinary sophistication." He adjusted a lamp with characteristic precision, illuminating the emerging text more clearly. But first, we must understand what we truly confront. The Countess Isabella de Montclair was not merely a victim of political conspiracy. She was its architect. The evidence now emerging reveals her as a woman who discovered systematic embezzlement from the French treasury and chose not to expose it, but to control it through superior intelligence and strategic manipulation. The scientific foundation. Dr. Thornley leaned forward with clinical fascination as additional details became visible. "Those chemical compounds you identified, they've created a multi-layered revelation system." "Précisément, Doctor. The portrait's resistance to flame resulted from specific treatments, alum, borax, phosphates, applied with surgical precision to create dramatic effect while preserving the canvas for further revelation. But observe the constellation of pinpricks I discovered earlier." Poirot indicated the minute perforations with his jeweler's loupe, modern additions to the 17th century work, serving as guides for the precise application of moisture to reveal hidden text. He moved to his evidence table, where the blotter impressions lay preserved under glass. The ghost of handwriting, mes amis, often proves more eloquent than living words. These impressions reveal detailed instructions for the chemical processes, measurements, proportions, timing sequences. Someone with intimate knowledge of both historical chemistry and modern conservation techniques prepared this portrait across weeks, perhaps months, for tonight's revelation. The psychological web. Our murderer, Poirot continued, beginning his characteristic pacing, demonstrated from the beginning a mind that thinks not merely one move ahead, but several moves simultaneously. Consider the orchestration. An anonymous letter timed to arrive precisely 3 days before this gathering, written in a tone calculated to provoke Lady Pemberton's characteristic directness. The dramatic fire test was not spontaneous defiance. It was the opening movement of a carefully choreographed performance. Lady Pemberton's gray eyes flashed with understanding and wounded pride. "You're saying someone manipulated me into providing the perfect distraction for murder." "I'm stating it as established fact, madame. Someone who understood your psychology intimately enough to predict your response. The timing of Timothy Marsh's death, at the precise moment when flames drew all eyes and gasps of amazement masked the sound of a small-caliber pistol, was calculated with mathematical precision." Poirot paused beside the portrait, where the storm's continued effects were revealing additional genealogical information. Young Marsh possessed the scientific key through his photographic analysis. Miss Hartwell discovered the historical context through her archival research. Together, they held the complete solution to the Countess's legacy. Our murderer needed both pieces of the puzzle, but could not allow either researcher to reveal their discoveries independently. The evidence converges. "The physical evidence," Poirot announced, producing his leather notebook, "tells a story of meticulous preparation and desperate improvisation. The handwriting impressed upon Lady Pemberton's blotter matches precisely the careful script in the household account books. The same measured T-crossings, identical slant, unmistakable consistency." He gestured toward the assembled suspects. "Yesterday, I observed a fine white residue fall from someone's glove. Chalk dust, or perhaps alum powder from the compounds used to treat the canvas. The technique employed, pinpricks forming constellations, is known as pouncing, used by restorers to transfer patterns, but it requires intimate access to the portrait across extended periods. Inspector Bradshaw stepped forward, his professional attention fully engaged. And the planted weapon? Ah, the derringer found with Monsieur Blackwood's fingerprints, Poirot replied with satisfaction. Dr. Thornley's examination revealed no powder burns on anyone present. The killer fired through cloth or while gloved. The weapon was subsequently forced into innocent hands, perhaps during the confusion of discovering the body, creating fresh prints while eliminating the murderer's own traces. The moment of truth, Poirot's penetrating gaze settled upon Miss Catherine Fairfax, who had maintained her characteristic quiet composure throughout the evening's revelations. The little gray cells perceive a pattern, Mademoiselle Fairfax. You possessed the intimate knowledge of this household's routines. You had access to the portrait for extended chemical preparation. You demonstrated no surprise when I revealed the specific compounds used in the treatments. Most tellingly, you showed the psychological sophistication to orchestrate not merely murder, but the entire investigation's direction. For the first time since we had met her, Miss Fairfax's composure showed hairline cracks. Her hands, usually so steady in their quiet efficiency, trembled almost imperceptibly as she folded them in her lap. Your description of the Countess's expression, Poirot continued relentlessly, a warning to those perceptive enough to understand her message, was not interpretation, but recognition. You understood her message because you were raised with knowledge of it, waiting for the opportunity to unlock your inheritance. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Miss Fairfax rose from her chair with fluid grace, her entire bearing shifting as she abandoned the role she had played for years. The quiet efficiency remained, but now it carried the unmistakable authority of aristocratic breeding and intellectual superiority. You are correct, of course, Monsieur Poirot, she acknowledged with calm dignity that would have done credit to her ancestor. I am Catherine de Montclair, the last direct descendant of Countess Isabella, and the rightful heir to secrets that have shaped European history for 3 centuries. The confession, lady. Pemberton stared at her companion with dawning comprehension and profound betrayal. Catherine, why? Why not simply reveal your identity? I would have helped you claim your heritage. Because, my dear Lady Pemberton, Miss de Montclair replied with a smile that carried echoes of the painted expression above them. The modern world has little patience for the methods by which such legacies are acquired and maintained. The Countess Isabella's records document centuries of what contemporary society would term systematic criminal conspiracy, financial manipulation, political intelligence, and strategic exploitation that built fortunes and toppled governments. She moved toward the portrait, her eyes reflecting the same calculating intelligence visible in the painted features. Timothy Marsh's photographic analysis threatened to expose these connections to academic scrutiny before I could properly control the revelation. His meticulous documentation would have made the portrait's secrets public property, destroying centuries of careful concealment. And Miss Hartwell's historical research provided the missing context, Poirot observed. The diplomat's journal, the Countess's own letter. Together, they possessed the complete key to your ancestors' legacy. Precisely. I had cultivated relationships with both researchers, guiding their investigations while ensuring they never possessed the complete picture simultaneously. But when Miss Hartwell discovered the full historical context, my time ran out. I struck in desperation, abandoning the calculated precision that had served me so well. Justice and legacy. Inspector Bradshaw stepped forward with professional authority. Miss de Montclair, you are under arrest for the murder of Timothy Marsh and the assault upon Miss Hartwell. Of course, she replied with aristocratic composure that remained unshaken even in defeat. But consider, Inspector, what you are truly arresting, the last heir to one of Europe's most significant historical legacies. The portrait's complete revelation will transform our understanding of 3 centuries of political and financial development. As the constables moved to restrain her, Miss de Montclair turned once more to the portrait of her ancestor. Lightning illuminated the room, casting dramatic shadows across the canvas, where the Countess's secrets continued their chemical emergence. The painted eyes seemed to observe the culmination of her descendants' efforts with the same calculating intelligence that had orchestrated the original conspiracy. The Countess Isabella wrote that her legacy would demand sacrifices from each generation, she said with quiet pride. She was correct, as always. But some legacies are worth any price, even murder. The final resolution. As Miss de Montclair was led away with dignity and tact despite her circumstances, Poirot straightened a slight irregularity in the carpet with characteristic fastidiousness. The storm outside began to subside as dawn approached, but the portrait continued its chemical revelation, promising to yield secrets that would occupy historians and investigators for years to come. The little gray cells, Poirot murmured to me as the last of the lightning faded into gray morning light. They perceive that we have witnessed not merely the solution to a murder, but the final chapter of a story that began in the court of Louis XIII and has shaped European history through centuries of careful manipulation. The affair of the portrait that refused to burn had concluded with justice served, but it had also unveiled a legacy of deception and brilliance that would forever change our understanding of the forces that shaped the modern world. The Countess Isabella had finally achieved her ultimate victory, her secrets revealed, her descendants' devotion proven, and her legacy secured for posterity, regardless of the price in blood and betrayal that such revelations had demanded. As I watched the dawn light gradually replace the storm's dramatic illumination, I could not escape the feeling that we had been participants in a drama orchestrated from beyond the grave, where painted eyes held secrets that had waited 3 centuries to claim their final victims in the eternal struggle between truth and power.